basically count your blessings. Think about the positive things. Where you put your time and your talents, where you put your attention, is where you're going to focus. You might hear this in a non-scriptural sense where somebody says, start your day every day by counting your blessings. I think it's great advice in general, but it's wonderful to see it in the scriptures. A very important thing, I think, is to look at examples from the Bible of again, how we fit into God's plan. Unfortunately, a big part of what causes stress for many people is that we are in the middle of God's plan, and we don't see the end. We don't see where it's going. Okay, so our stress is because we want a result now, or we want something to change now. Again, when you ask for these things in your prayers, they may not be answered, like I said, in your time frame of the way you want. So some examples I use are that, Abraham, the father of the Israel nation, is promised when he's 75 years old by God that he's going to have descendants that number as many as the stars. And God promises him that, and eventually we know now as Christians, which I'll get into in a second, that means that not only the Jewish nation, but on to what will lead to the Messiah and Christianity as we now practice it. But what happens is that it doesn't happen like he and Sarah, his wife, think. So when he's 86 years old, they haven't had any children yet. And so they just he and his wife decide actually that he's going to take one of her handmaidens as his wife, and he bears a child, Ishmael, with her. And the tradition is that Ishmael actually is the founder of the Arab nations, and that he and the Jews, or that nation of the Jews, are at each other forever. And so because they didn't really because they were thinking of their time frame and not God's time frame, it caused a problem, is basically what I'm trying to get at. So then when he's 100 years old, Isaac is finally born. It took God 25 years to answer that promise, okay? So, and he was 100 years old. As a matter of fact, you probably remember this story from the Old Testament that's, when God appears to them in the form of an angel, Sarah laughs when they say that you're going to have a child. And because she's well beyond, the scriptures say she's well beyond childbearing years and so forth, obviously at 100. So, and then when you look at time frames, it takes 42 generations. When you look at the first chapter of Matthew in the New Testament, 42 generations to go from Abraham all the way to Jesus. Okay, so now the covenant with David is another example of this. That there's a covenant with David where God makes a promise with him that the Messiah will come from it, a king's reign that will be never ending. And in the covenant, in 2 Samuel, he actually says this 3 times. God says to David that there will be a reign that never ends. And so he's not talking about that David's descendants will carry on his earthly kingdom, but he's talking about Jesus coming, the Messiah. But again, this takes 28 generations, thousands of years before Jesus is finally born. Okay? And then again, when we look at God's plan, sometimes things that are for God's eternal plan don't fit into our plan. I sometimes think that, depending on what authority you read, we don't know for sure in the scriptures, but most people say that Mary was probably somewhere between 12 and a half to maybe 14, 15 years old when she had Jesus. So imagine being a teenager and having the angel Gabriel appear to you and tell you that you're going to bear Emmanuel, you're going to become pregnant by the Holy Spirit, and that not only that, but to know, because she studied the Jewish law, she was a good Jew, she knew the scriptures, she knew that because she was betrothed to Joseph, that she could be stoned for becoming pregnant outside of marriage. So obviously this fulfilled in God's eternal plan. I think there's some variation about the beliefs with Mary in the larger Christian community, but definitely I think most people agree that just like Eve basically said no to God, that Mary said yes to God, and so through her salvation came about. I read a story once that all of heaven was holding their breath when the angel Gabriel talked to Mary. Obviously, if she she hadn't said yes, I'm sure God would have gotten his plan across one way or the other, just like he did with Abraham and Sarah. But thank God she said yes, and it worked out. Okay, so the last example I want to talk about is eternity, because again, when we're looking at God's plan, what we're really looking at is a time span that is so big that it's beyond our human comprehension, really. When we look at eternity, because that's really my belief is his plan for us is to serve and love him as we're alive, and then to be with him for eternity. And so I want to just relate to you a story that got me to understand kind of what eternity was, or it's a way to think about it, is that I had a pastor one time that said, thinking about eternity is such an immense amount of time. The good way to think about it is that imagine that a man went to the beach and he picked up a grain of sand. And then he took a step, but he was really, really slow, so it took him 10,000 years to take a step. And then he took another step, and that took him another 10,000 years. And every step was 10,000 years, and he went all the way to the top of Mount Everest, and he dropped off that grain of sand. And then he went back to the beach, and it was another 10,000 years for every step. So let's say it took him 1 million years or 1 billion years to get to the top of Mount Everest. And then he repeated that for every grain of sand on every beach, of every shore, of every lake and ocean. That when he was done, eternity would still just be beginning. Okay. So, and to me that was like, wow, yeah, okay, now I can a little bit wrap my mind around what you're talking about. In other words, and for me, the struggles I might have in this life seem a little bit less significant when I realize that they are for a very short period of time compared to the eternity that I believe that we all long for with God forever. Okay? So that may not help everybody, but those things I think are important, and I think they help me definitely to look at stress in the right perspective. All right. Now it seems like a big jump, but we're going to talk now about exercise. Of all the things that we can do on our own on a lifestyle basis, exercise has one of the biggest effects on stress and has some of the best research to support the benefits of exercise. Okay. What's interesting is that there was a landmark study done several years ago where it showed that as little as 20 minutes of walking 3 times a week was more effective than taking antidepressants for dealing with patients even that had clinical depression and anxiety. And the interesting thing about this study was it was a group of women, and they actually broke them into 3 groups. And they had one group that walked 20 minutes a day, 3 times a week. And then they had one group that took, it was Prozac was the medication they were studying, that took Prozac. And then they had a third group that interestingly did both. And this was a long-term study. They actually followed these women for 5 years. And what they found was that the group of women that did the walking alone had the best reduction of their depression and anxiety. They also, when they followed them over 5 years, a huge thing is that they had the fewest relapses of anxiety and depression, because a lot of times anxiety and depression can be episodic, that people have episodes that come and go. So the cool thing about that was that, one, you don't have to be exercising for hours every day. It was literally just walking. 20 minutes 3 times a week, that's an hour a week. Most people spend more time than that just in one day watching television or whatever. So you don't have to designate a lot of time. It showed that for a fairly small investment, you could get a big return on your mental health. But also it was interesting that they found that their theory, why the women that walked alone had the best success, was that they had that perceived level of that they were actively doing something to help their stress, as opposed to relying on that medication. Now, we know since that study came out, there's been other studies that actually show that the ironic thing is that many of the drugs, like Prozac, the selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, one of the side effects is they can actually cause depression and anxiety. So I would say that another reason why maybe the women that walked alone got better success is that, unfortunately, some of the medications that are commonly prescribed for depression, actually one of their listed side effects can be further depression. As a matter of fact, you probably know that many of those drugs carry a black box warning, which is an FDA's warning for increased risk of suicide and more serious depression, especially in children and teenagers. So one of the reasons why this topic is so important to talk about is that there are literally people dying unnecessarily daily, every day, because they're taking their own life or having even not only feelings of hurting themselves, but feelings for hurting others because of some of the side effects from these drugs. Okay, and the sad thing is that exercise has been shown to be more effective. So you can do something that has beneficial side effects. It's going to help your heart and your lungs and some of the other reasons why you should exercise. Okay, so if you know somebody that's taking those kinds of drugs or dealing with that, they definitely need to see a chiropractor or see somebody that can help them on a road of a more natural approach. And because chiropractors don't prescribe medicine, we don't tell people just stop taking those, but we work with their medical doctor many times to try to get a plan of reducing those or getting off with them. Okay, but for some people, a lot of people. So the other thing is that exercise, it makes sense. It's a natural resolution to that fight or flight response because that physiological response to stress is to prepare you for action. An obvious way to resolve that is to have some action, to move, to run. The problem with many of us is that we're under, like I said, that perceived level of stress all the time from maybe things that aren't a bear or aren't a mountain lion, but we don't have any resolution of it. We just internalize that stress, and that's one of the ways that it then negatively affects your health. Things like raising your blood pressure, suppressing your immune system, increasing your risk of cancer and heart disease, and all those things because of what it does to your body physiologically. Most Americans, unfortunately, are deficient in movement. Most people think of the word deficiency in a nutritional sense, but we need exercise on a regular basis just like we need vitamins and minerals and protein and carbohydrates and healthy fats. Okay? The U.S. Department of Health recommends an hour of exercise most days of the week just to stay healthy. Now, they're not specifically talking about stress with that recommendation, but just for your overall health. 20 minutes 3 times a week is good. I would say for most people, if you can do it, a little bit more is even better. And not to confuse you, but one thing that's important to know is that you can, like with anything, moderation is the key. Too much exercise can be a form of stress. It's normally not a problem for most Americans, but if you're somebody that's like training for a marathon, or you're somebody that's a competitive athlete involved in a competitive sport, it's important to have some rest time. It's important to have, like, for sure, 1 day a week at least that you're not exercising, or to have moderation. I have some of my patients that are triathletes and compete in, tournament kind of tennis and different kind of athletics, where it's important for them to also have kinds of exercise that aren't so intense. So maybe they incorporate specific exercises like yoga or Tai Chi, which I'll talk about in a few minutes, that incorporates breathing and is a relaxation kind of exercise to help round out their exercise so that they're not ramping up their stress level with intense exercise. Okay. Exercise improves cognitive function, which means it improves improves your memory, it improves learning. That's well documented. And another interesting thing that I added in here that I actually just read last week is that there's studies of longevity that show that exercise actually reverses